So it is. We're come back together again. I'll tell you, it's nice. It's nice to have a crowd, right? If you are, let's see, I have a couple questions here. If you have not met someone new today, that's on you. So you don't want to leave shul feeling guilty, so make sure you introduce yourself to someone that you don't know. And so that's a good thing. I also want to remind you that not to use your cell phones, because it is Shabbat. So don't worry, anyone that you need to talk to is right here. And I gave the fuller introduction before of Ambassador Ross, and the essence of it, if you were here if you were davening somewhere else and came just for the talk, is that his qualifications are extensive. It's been a pleasure to have both David Makovsky and Dennis Ross here for the Shabbat.
It's my pleasure too. It is interesting, you were saying when in the original introduction, you talked about my running the Berkeley-Stanford program, and that showed my real capacity to handle conflict. The interesting thing is I have often been asked, I was a political appointee for 2 Republican presidents and 2 Democratic presidents. And aside from that making me an extinct species, people have often asked, how did you manage that? And I said, I've spent 30 years working with Arabs and Israelis. How hard could it be? So I want to delve, you want to hear me too? Okay. It's better now? Actually, it's better if I speak it. No, you can't hear me. How about now? Back there, okay? Okay, I'll speak into one mic. So what I raised before seemed, as I said, compelling. And the question you might logically ask, in fact, the question you should ask is, so why isn't this issue being debated in Israel? I mean, having it discussed here is fine, but we're not the ones who are going to make the decision. So why isn't it being debated in Israel? And there are some logical, even understandable reasons for why it's not being debated in Israel. In the first instance, it's an abstraction. Okay, you explain, but you will become a binational state unless you stop building outside the blocks. But most Israelis are focused on not abstractions, but the tangible reality of what the region looks like. And what does the region look like? Well, there was a war in Iraq with no limitations. There was a war in Syria with no limitations. The Iranians and Shia militias are establishing themselves in Syria, even now. Hezbollah has 130,000 rockets, not abstract. ISIS affiliates are in the Sinai. Hamas controls Gaza. And I will tell you, there's a real risk come March 30th that this is going to blow up again. Why? Because March 30th marks the 1-year anniversary of when Hamas began these demonstrations at the fence. And many of the leaders of Hamas think that they can actually defeat Netanyahu. So they think if they heat things up, maybe that'll be good. Well, the truth is, Bibi, with an election in 10 days, is not going to respond in a soft way. So you're an Israeli, this is what you're living with every day. And the idea of an abstraction versus the reality of what you face at a time when the truth is, even though Trump gives Israel verbal support, diplomatic support at the UN, says Israel has the right of self-defense, all of which is good. But when it comes to dealing with the Iranians in Syria, you're on your own. When it comes to managing the Russians in Syria, you're on your own. There was a historic bargain, I can tell you because I was part of it, where we would provide Israel material support. When it came to dealing with the threats in the region, Israel took care of that, not us. But we had the responsibility for dealing with the threats from outside the region. If you go back to 1970, in what was then known as Black September, The Syrians sent 300 tanks across the border into Jordan. We were tied down in Cambodia. You may recall a few months before, in May, the Nixon administration had spread the war into Cambodia, and it produced a huge backlash here. I was on one of those on campuses demonstrating against it. So it's a huge backlash here. The administration needed someone else to assume the responsibility for trying to deter this. So we asked, Kissinger asked, actually over Nixon's initial reluctance, asked the Israelis to mobilize their forces on the Golan Heights. And what did the Israelis say? We'll do it, but we need you to deter the Soviets. Nixon sent a very blunt message to Brezhnev. We actually moved some forces in the Eastern Med closer towards Israel. We let it be known that we were flying tankers into Israel at the same time. Everything was designed to show, okay, our responsibility is to handle the Soviets. Today, that bargain, Israel takes care of countries in the region and threats non-state actors within the region. We'll deal with the Russians or others? No, we don't. So you're an Israeli, and the one thing you know is, okay, it's on us. We're on our own. Now, there's a level of confidence, but these are real threats. This is what people feel. And so there's a dimension here where Israelis aren't focused on this because they're paying more attention somehow to what they see are the real threats in the region. And there's still a sense, well, we can manage it later. What we're trying to highlight is, no, the problem is if you let it drift, there'll be a tipping point. Nobody knows exactly when the tipping point is, where suddenly, okay, you've lost the ability to preserve separation. But that's the problem. Once you cross it, it's too late. Then you can't have separation, and then you're stuck with this reality. Now, what I just said is only part of the explanation for why this is not being debated. There's another part of the explanation. The right wing in Israel and the settler community in Israel lives in a world of denial. They deny there's a problem. Now, they make two different cases to deny it. One is, we'll be fine because we can give the Palestinians autonomy on 40% of the West Bank. We'll be fine. We won't be one state. There's only one problem with that. Palestinians will never accept it, and the rest of the world will never accept it. And 40% autonomy and 40% guarantees they can never be economically viable. You're disconnecting them from the economic hinterland that they need from an agricultural sense, from a potential industrial sense, from a potential tourist sense, if they could have access to part of the Dead Sea. The World Bank says if the Palestinian Authority simply had access to what's known as Area C, 60% of the West Bank, not control, simply economic access, their GDP, gross domestic product, would immediately increase by 35%. So for those who say, oh, we can give them autonomy, they're not actually even willing to give them autonomy. That's part of the problem. And they're doing it on too small a slice of territory, and it's not going to be accepted by anybody else. When you raise those arguments with them, some of them, people like Naftali Bennett, are actually honest enough to say, well, we know it's not a good solution. Maybe in 20 years, they can become part of Jordan. Yes, and if the Moshiach arrives, they may become part of Jordan. The only problem with having them become part of Jordan is the Jordanians are dead set against it. So the two options they lay out are not realistic. That's a kind way of saying it. Now, there's another argument they make. They say the demographic argument isn't real. Now, I gave you an example before, but I want to drill down and explain this a little bit more deeply. I gave the example of what things were like in 1986. In fact, you're not having to count the 2 million Arabs, and there is an additional 1 million Jews. What's the argument they make on demographics? They say the numbers aren't that bad. The professional demographers double count the Palestinians, and they say the actual numbers today are 65% Jews and 35% Arabs. Now, the professional demographers say, no, the actual numbers today are 61% Jews and 39% Arabs. Is that a big difference? I mean, if you really look at what they're saying, what you're saying is they're already admitting that there's a problem. People like Moshe Aarons, who died recently, was prepared to acknowledge it's a problem, but his view was, in the end, we'll simply have to give all the Palestinians or all the Arabs who live there that we absorb, we'll have to give them citizenship. And we'll live with the consequence. We can manage it. Menachem Begin, I'll get to it in a minute, he was ultimately prepared to do it too. Aaron's Begin, the current president of Israel, Ruvi Rivlin, they represent the original, traditional Likudniks who were true followers of Jabotinsky in the sense that they believed in liberal values. They would never tolerate the emergence of a kind of illiberal state because that's not who they were. The rule of law was essential to them. So we have a different right today for whom that's less important. The demographic argument that they make doesn't hold up, not because necessarily the numbers they're presenting right now are wrong, but because when it's even if it's 65-35, you now have two national identities as opposed to 80-20 where it's a majority and minority. And they try to say, okay, our birth rates have gone up, which is true. The Arab birth rates have gone down, which is true. The problem is the Arab birth rates still exceed the Jewish birth rates. So the 65-35 isn't going to stay 65-35, but my position and our collective position is that even if it's going to be 40 years before you have parity, well before you get to that point, you face a choice. And if you've lost the ability to separate, then the character of Israel is changed for good. And the essence of the Zionist mission of being Jewish and democratic has been lost. As I said a little earlier, it would be ironic that it's the right in Israel that basically plays to a default Palestinian strategy. Sooner or later, we'll just have one state. Well, they may be producing it. Okay, so that's why a big decision is needed. As I said before, it's a big decision because of the real political makeup in Israel today, although I should say a word about the Israeli elections. The formation of this bloc by Gantz, Lapid, Gabi Ashkenazi, Ya'alon, it does change the dynamic in this election. First of all, it changes it because it takes the security card away from Bibi. Second, it changes it because it suddenly creates a sense of possibility where there was none before. The universal conception was, well, Bibi's going to be the next prime minister, even if there's an indictment hanging over his head. For some, because there's an indictment hanging over his head. But this creates a sense of possibility that wasn't there. If, in fact, an indictment comes in the coming week, and I think if it doesn't come within the coming week to 10 days, it probably doesn't come until after the election. If it comes in the next 7 to 10 days, everyone says there will be all sorts of leaks, because there's literally 1,000 pages of evidence that has been collected by the Attorney General. And the Attorney General was Bibi's cabinet secretary. When a prime minister appoints a cabinet secretary, it's always one of the people closest to them. Mandelblit was one of the closest people to him. And Mandelblit has been extremely careful. He was criticized for a long time because he was moving so slowly on a possible indictment. It's pretty clear that Bibi expects him to come with an indictment now. The question is, will the indictment, A, include bribery, which the expectation is it will, not just breach of trust, but there's also an expectation that there will be leaks that reveal new information that hasn't been out before. Now, if that's true, then I think Bibi might be in trouble. I would never count him out. He is the master of Israeli politics. He has 9 lives. He reads the Israeli public in a way that others don't. He has, again, and let's understand the dynamics of Israeli politics. Likud got 25% of the vote in the last election. A majority of Israeli Jews today say, Bibi's been prime minister for too long, time for a change. But it's not the majority that counts. It's who can put together 61 in the Knesset. And so I don't discount Bibi, but what I'm raising for you is the uncertainty now. before this coalition on the center, basically center, it's broad, because there are people on the right who are part of it, Yalon. Before this was put together, before the bloc that emerged, I would have said Bibi will emerge as the prime minister, and the real issue will be, does he make Gantz and Lapid his defense and foreign minister, or does he go for a narrow right-wing government? That choice would be, does he think a narrow right-wing government ensures the people who are so ideological, they'll try to keep him as prime minister even if he's facing indictment and prosecution, and they'll just have him over a barrel. They'll be able to dictate whatever he does. Or does he think that if he goes for a centrist government, does that put him in a position where the impulse towards prosecution will decline because it looks like there's a political possibility now? And I can tell you this is one way in which Israel has become a Middle Eastern state, the sense of conspiracy. Yeah, I like to say about the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, conspiracy is like oxygen and everybody breathes it. There's nothing ever happens by chance, nothing ever happens because of a mistake. It happens because it was all some sort of plot. And there are those in Israel who are convinced that if Bibi goes for this, it's simply because he thinks that the left then will not want him prosecuted because now he'll do something on the peace issue. I don't buy any of that. I think the issue is going to be, an election that we'll have to see how things change. But I think there's a level of uncertainty. Okay, so the context is such that an Israeli government's going to have to make a choice. Now, the reason we look back, as I said, at 4 leaders who made big decisions is we wanted to look at those who made big decisions that they knew had great controversy, that didn't necessarily, in 3 of the 4 cases, basically had them going against their own constituency, their own followers. Because in effect, if it's an Israeli government that is right of center, it's going to have to take on its constituency. So we picked Ben-Gurion because he makes the biggest decisions in the state. The Declaration of Statehood, I don't know how much you went into this, but I mean, when he makes a decision on statehood, it's, the leaders of the new IDF, Yadin and Galili, are saying we need more time. The pressure from the U.S. is don't do this. But Ben-Gurion says, with the end of the mandate, if we don't declare it now, we'll never have the same justification again. And the price will be high. He knew the price was going to be measured in blood. But it meant, in his mind, no Israel. And he prevails. And he prevails because what is happening? He looks at the consequence of no decision. Whenever you are faced with a choice, there's always the cost of action, and there's always the cost of inaction. The cost of action is always easy to measure. The cost of inaction is hard to measure. And I can say this from having spent 3 years in the Obama administration. President Obama always looked at the cost of action, never the cost of inaction. Ben-Gurion was a visionary in every sense of the word. A story that Shimon Peres used to tell. In 1960, Ben-Gurion was having lunch with de Gaulle in Paris. And de Gaulle says to him, what do you most need? What do you most want? He says, more Jews. And de Gaulle says, well, they're not coming from here. And he says, where are they going to come from? This is 1960, and Ben-Gurion says, the Soviet Union will collapse in 30 years, and they'll come from there. When did it collapse? In 31 years. He understood things. He gives a speech in 1932, before Hitler is there, outlining the dangers. He sees through the Arab revolt. He gives up his view that the Arabs of Palestine can be folded into a larger Arab entity. He recognizes Arab nationalism, but it takes the Arab revolt 36 to 39 for him to recognize that there's such a thing as the Arabs of Palestine having an identity. And he realized from that point on, you're going to have to fight. So he's a visionary, and he understands both the cost of action but also the cost of inaction. Begin is a man of enormous principle. A story that he tells Carter as a way of revealing who he is. He tells the story of how his father is walking with a rabbi, and a soldier comes along and wants to humiliate the rabbi and cut off his beard. His father uses a walking stick to attack or hit the soldier, and he's severely beaten. Begin tells Carter the story when he first meets him because he wants him to know who he is, what the legacy is, where he comes from. This is a guy who is not just a devotee of Jabotinsky, but he views him as his master, as his teacher. But when Jabotinsky isn't prepared to be tough enough on the British, in a convention of Beitar, he goes against him and he wins. He is a man of enormous principle and belief. One of the stories in the Begin chapter that is remarkable, he believes Jews can't fight Jews. He believes the British want that. And so, even after the bombing of the King David, when the Haganah in the aftermath of that begins to respond to the British demand that they turn in people from Irgun. He says, the gap between purity and contamination, he holds up a piece of paper and says, that's how thin it is. After the Altalena, when one of the deputies says to him, I'm going to assassinate Ben Gurion, he says, you have to kill me first. This is a guy who has strong beliefs, but he's a guy who also sees, again, the future a certain way. What's interesting about Begin is that, again, just as I was saying before about Likud and those who are really the founders of Likud, those who believe in its values, they have liberal values. One of the things David did is he went and he read all the minutes of a debate from June 14th to June 19th, 1967. The most intensive debate of any Israeli government over the future of the West Bank was held between June 14th and June 19th, 1967. And in that debate, Begin doesn't have an answer on the demographics. But he says he wants to keep the territory, but he says we have to give them same rights. Now he says we'll take 7 years to give them the rights, but he wants to give them. They're going to have the same rights. He hopes Aliyah from the outside will answer the demographic challenge. When he makes the decision to respond to Sadat, and the response is not just the withdrawal from the Sinai, but it's the autonomy plan. The Labor Party attacks the autonomy plan, even though in the end it supports Camp David, on the grounds it's a slippery slope to a state. Those closest to him, his closest comrades from the Irgun, they're against it. But he understands not to do it. He sees we've fought 4 wars with the Egyptians. He knows what the costs are. And he says not to do this may mean another war. So he literally bites the bullet. He understands, again, the consequence of not acting, even if it means his closest comrades are prepared to call him a traitor, which wounds him. I saw him as a student in 1972 give a speech at Hebrew University. He was a spellbinder in Hebrew, but he was also a spellbinder in English. He's the head, at this point he's still, he's an outsider. Labor still dominates everything. He gives a speech there in which he says, if we don't have a right to Hebron, we don't have a right to Tel Aviv. He was someone who believed in principle, but when faced with a choice, he was prepared to adopt positions that in a sense put the state first. What's consistent with each of these leaders is they always put the state first. If the politics were going to impose a high price, too bad. Rabin's mother is known as Red Rosa. She was a true radical. She wasn't a Zionist, but she sort of goes to Palestine almost by happenstance. She and her husband, they meet actually where she can also, she's a nurse as well, among others. She's a very talented person, all sorts of capabilities. There is an uprising against Jews in 1920 in Jerusalem, and she and her husband, they meet there. They both rush to be there. They are activists. They They have jobs. She actually works in as a kind of an accountant in a construction firm. He's in the first electric company there. They have jobs, but on the side, they're both organizers. Rabin, as a little boy, is basically largely on his own. Where is he sent? He's sent to a workers' school, because they had that. These were true socialists. I know that's a dirty term these days, but they were genuine socialists. He is responsible for helping. He has a sister who's 3 years younger. He assumes responsibility for her at the workers' school. Part of each day is not spent in education. It's spent with building, raising crops, cleaning up. They're taught responsibilities. All the exams are based on an honor code. Rabin is the most honest leader I ever dealt with. He literally could not lie. I used to say when he gave us a secret commitment that he was willing to withdraw from the Golan Heights if all of Israel's needs were met, I always knew that if a journalist knew just how to ask the question, he wouldn't have lied. But he would tell the technical truth, meaning he never would say something untrue, but sometimes you can say things that are technically true and misleading. He was the most intellectually honest leader I ever dealt with. He was analytical to a fault. Whenever you talk to him, he'd say, this is going to happen because of A, B, C, D, and E. If he had thought through a position, no chance of changing his position. But if you argued with him, and it turned out you were right, he'd come back to you and say, you were right and I was wrong. And I can honestly tell you, there's no leader I worked for here, whoever was prepared to say that. They might be prepared to say, I was wrong because you told me. But that was Rabin. Rabin was formed. His attitudes were shaped by first being in the Palmach and becoming, as a young man, the guy who is seen as brilliant in terms of planning operations. He assumes responsibility for protecting the convoys that have to break the siege of Jerusalem. Later in life, he gives speeches about, when you drive up the hill from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you see the remnants of the trucks. And he gives a speech where he talks about he can still hear the screams of those dying there. He feels like every soldier in the IDF is his son. He feels a deep responsibility. When for a long time, his attitude towards the Palestinians was he recognizes they are people that has to be dealt with, but he doesn't actually respect them. At one point, he's asked a question by somebody in the 1980s, why don't you deal with the Palestinians from the territories before the Intifada? And he says, if I go to one, he says, talk to King Hussein. I go to a different one, he says, talk to Mubarak. I go to a third one, he says, talk to Assad. I go to a fourth one, he says, talk to Arafat. Why should I talk to them when when they're not prepared to represent themselves? The Intifada changed him. It changed him because at that point, up until that point, he felt they would never do anything for themselves. You had to have an answer, but his answer was basically a Jordanian option. After the Intifada, which affects him in terms of believing that you can't coerce the Palestinians, which he thought you could. Then he becomes convinced there's only a political answer. But there's another factor that affects him because of the Intifada. He stays in the military after the War of Independence because he feels this profound debt of gratitude to those who have died. And he believes, notwithstanding everything Ben Gurion had done, he believes they were not prepared. The military was not prepared, and he vows the IDF will never be in that position again. He spends his whole life, he was going to be an agronomist. He had won a scholarship to attend the University of California at Berkeley. But he forgoes that, and he stays in the military because he's going to build the institution. And he does, he builds the institution. The Intifada, he sees as a threat to the institution. Some of the most elite units with officers engage in beatings of Palestinians, and they have to court-martial them. And he sees what it's doing to the fabric of the IDF. So this affects him. The fact that the Palestinians are prepared to stand up for themselves affects him. And then it's the political tsunami that sweeps the world, the end of the Cold War, new states emerging. The fact that Iraq was defeated by the United States, the fact that Iran is weak, he gives a speech in December of 1992 where he says, and this is before Oslo, where he says the big threat in this region will come from Iran. That's the big threat. But we have time right now. And we need to create peace with what he calls the inner circle so that we can insulate ourselves against that threat, which will be coming. And he also doesn't want to be out of step with what he sees as a time of opportunity. To miss an opportunity is to leave you worse off. So he doesn't go to Oslo and Arafat easily. You know, when it's okay. When Clinton has to coax he and Arafat into shaking hands. I mean, the moment is extraordinary because, again, it shows Rabin can't lie. He can't hide what he feels towards Arafat. At that moment, he literally can't do it. Arafat, he's got no problem. You know, yeah, he's ready to go shake hands and kiss everybody. I mean, you know, we're teaching Clinton how to keep him at arm's length. You know, put your arm on his elbow so he can't move closer to you. You know, Arafat will embrace everybody. And yet it's Rabin who gives the poignant speech that reaches out to Palestinians. It's Arafat who gives a terrible speech designed purely to deal only with his own constituency. But Rabin feels we don't have an alternative. He sought an alternative to deal with the PLO. There was no alternative to dealing with them. He makes this decision. In 1995, in February of 1995, he tells me, this is when I'm our negotiator, he tells me, we're going to build a fence. He says, we're going to build a fence because I hope we can reach an agreement with the Palestinians, but I don't know if we can. But I know this. I know if we don't separate from them, we will lose who we are. This is 1995. He's the author of the fence. At that time, Sharon is against the fence, although it is Sharon who ends up building the fence. And Sharon, you know, like Rabin, sees himself, he'll make big decisions, but he's not like Rabin in a lot of other ways. Rabin couldn't tell a lie. Sharon didn't have that problem. But Sharon, if you look at, again, his legacy, it's a remarkable legacy. He describes being a 5-year-old, riding up the hill to Jerusalem. He has an eye infection. His mother's taking him to a doctor up in Jerusalem, and he's looking through the windows of the bus to see Abu Jilda, who's a well-known Arab terrorist at the time. He's 5 years old, and he's looking out for this guy. His father and mother are complete iconoclasts. They live on a moshav. His father is actually an agronomist. He disagrees with everybody else at the moshav. You know, he'll plant what he plants. He ignores what everybody else is going to plant. When it comes time for the moshav decides that they're going to give land to a new moshav, not his father and mother. They fence off their plot. They won't let anybody take it. He, as a kid, Ariel Sharon, as a kid, is at night, is put there to guard the plot. By the way, not necessarily against people from the moshav, from Arab marauders. He's completely fearless from a young age. His mother sleeps with a gun under her pillow until she dies. When he's a minister and he goes to see Sadat at Sadat's request, he calls her to tell her he's in Cairo. And she's on the phone and says, don't trust the Arabs. And the interesting thing about him is he never fully trusts the Arabs, but he also respects them. He is a guy who is, when Begin gets elected, and he's made the Minister of Agriculture, and he chairs the Settlement Construction Committee. He comes in with a plan. He says, I'm the only Mapainik here, meaning I'm the only labor Zionist here. We do what we say. We don't just talk. We're not blah, blah. So if you approve what I'm going to do, don't come back later and complain if I've actually done it. For him, the ends always justify the means. I'm not going to go through everything he does when he's a soldier, but I will tell you, there's at least 3 times when he's almost drummed out of the military. 3 times. Ben-Gurion saves him. When Ben-Gurion resigns, he tells Rabin, all right, I've got a commitment from Eshkol. You will be the next chief of staff of the military. I'm asking one thing of you. Protect Arak. He is a great soldier. And Rabin, the first week that he's the head of the IDF, he says to Sharon, he said, look, everybody knows you're a great soldier. What nobody knows is whether you're a decent human being. I'm going to give you a chance. You're going to become the chief of staff to the head of Northern Command. If after 1 year I get the report back that you behaved honorably, then I'll make you a major general. And he does. He and Rabin are close. It doesn't mean that, the way he attacks Rabin over Oslo is merciless. It's as bad as Bibi, if not worse. And yet, the whole time that he attacks him in public, he goes and meets with him privately. Because Rabin respects his judgments. He'll bring Sharon in and he'll say, look, this is how we think about redeployment. And Sharon will go over the maps and he'll say, no, you can't move from that hill. You need that hill. When he, Sharon, decides that he's going to withdraw from Gaza and he's going to withdraw from 4 settlements in the West Bank, and I'll get to in a second why he makes this decision. The people planning this come in and show them the maps. And they think they're at places that seem completely isolated and therefore no Jews there, no reason, very limited Jewish presence, no reason to stay there. And he says, no. This is like a cul-de-sac where if you send forces in there, they can't move. This becomes a kind of bottleneck that if we were ever threatened from the outside, a very small presence would allow us to ensure that we could stop any kind of offensive. We can't leave there. He was a master of the maps. Dayan used to say about him that he treated maps the way a symphony conductor treats his orchestra. He was a detailed person on this. He plans for settlements that he plans in 77. They lay out the whole blueprint for what you have today. And yet, he's the guy who dismantles them. Twice. First in the Sinai, because Begin makes him defense minister for that reason alone, and then in Gaza, and then in the West Bank. Why? What changed? He becomes convinced, much like Rabin, first, what occupation is doing to the military. First and foremost. During the Second Intifada, there is an advertisement taken out by reserve pilots saying they won't fly missions over the West Bank. And then the most elite commando unit, officers from that send him a letter saying they won't operate there. And one of the guys who works for him says, but they're just leftists. And he slams his fist on the table. He says, no, they're not. I have done the most sensitive operations with them. And if we have a problem with them, we have a deeper problem. So, like Rabin, it's the threat to the military on the one hand, but it's also the demographics. He says we're not going to become a binational state. He says to Likud, I know you don't like the word occupation, but that's what it is. So he is prepared to dismantle the very settlements he built. He gives a very emotional speech, which we put in the chapter, where he explains how heart-wrenching this is for him, how difficult this is for him to ask the people he sent there to leave. But he says, my duty to the state is to do it. And that's, as I said, what combines these 4 leaders. It's their duty to the state. And the key challenge, if what he said to me about they're all politicians now is right, then the question becomes, okay, what can we Americans, we as a government and we as individuals, or as part of the Jewish community, what can we do to make it more likely? Now, I gave one example in terms of an administration, what an administration can do. There's several things an administration can do. Beyond giving Israel a commitment, the Israeli government a commitment, which should be enshrined by the Congress as well. Beyond giving a commitment that you don't have to do anything else until there's a response. There are several other things we should do on top of that. One is, at the same time, before the Israelis act on the decision, we should have an understanding with them so we can use it with the Arabs, the Palestinians, and with the Europeans. With the Europeans, we should have an understanding that they won't just come out and publicly support what the Israelis will do. They will be prepared for the first time to criticize the Palestinians publicly if they don't respond. The way to put pressure on the Palestinians is for them to understand that the one thing they think they've achieved, which is international acceptance of their cause, they're putting at jeopardy. Because the Europeans never exhibit tough love in public. They're always keen, is one of David's favorite themes, they're always keen on having us do it with the Israelis, but they never do it with the Palestinians. So one of the things that an American administration, it would be hard for this administration to do it because there aren't too many in Europe who are prepared, at least in Western Europe, who are prepared to listen to them. But an American administration needs to basically go and say, we are going to work with the Israelis. The Israelis are going to take what is a big step. We need you to endorse it when it's done, and we need you to publicly call on the Palestinians and be prepared to criticize them if they do not respond. Do the same with the Arabs. We should be going to the Arabs and say, this is what the Israelis are going to do. Let's talk about the steps of public outreach towards Israel that you are prepared to take. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that Israel does with the Arabs in the shadows right now. You know, the administration asked me to go to Warsaw a week ago, where I moderated a panel with 3 Arab ministers. I called them up, wasn't quite the Bima, but I called them up to what was something that looked like the Bima. And I did a conversation with them, and I asked them some leading questions. Bibi was in the audience. When we finished, then I asked Bibi to come up on the stage. It was like being in a room smaller than this size, having a conversation, in a sense asking each questions about the other. In effect, they were talking to each other. It's what I call the new normal. It's not normalization, but it's the new normal. Because there's a common sense of threat. And the Israelis are seen as more reliable, frankly, than we are in terms of dealing with that threat. But when those Arab ministers went outside and their own media asked them questions about this, they shied away from any comment. Yes, a lot is going on below the radar screen, and it's important. It's real. But as long as they can't admit it in public, there's a problem, there's a limitation. So if Israel's taking a step on the Palestinians that is significant of the sort we're describing, then there has to be pressure put on them to do more in public as a way of saying it's acceptable. The fact that you can't say it in public means it's still not acceptable. So that has to be something else that is done. We need to get commitments from the Europeans on, you said you talked about BDS, on fighting the delegitimization movement in public. What Israel is doing at that moment is it's making it clear, okay, we're doing our part when we take these steps to preserve a two-state outcome. So if we're doing our part for a two-state outcome, what is the possible justification at that point for the continuing the delegitimization movement? That requires a much more overt approach on the part of European governments as well. These are steps that can be taken. There are other steps that can be taken related more to Israel's security. There are 2 additional steps that are more controversial. I don't consider what I just said as being controversial. There are 2 steps that could be done that I consider to be more controversial. The first one I wouldn't do without first having gone to the Arabs and sought from them steps in public towards Israel. Why is that important? Because that creates much greater political tailwind for an Israeli decision maker. If he can point to what he's done and how the Arabs are actually responding in a way that's public, it gives him much greater credence with the Israeli public. So I would go to the Arabs and say, this is here are the range of things we need you to be doing. I mean, one of the things I'd like them to do is have the Saudis and others send a delegation to Jerusalem publicly to meet officials, to meet with their Israeli counterparts, to discuss common threats in the region. They're doing this privately. Do it in public. Be huge. And if they're not prepared to do that, I would let them know if we get no moves from the Arabs and no moves from the Palestinians, we will support the idea of the Israelis annexing block areas. Now, what we'll say at the same time is the exact boundaries we won't recognize because they'll still need to be negotiated, but we're basically going to accept that these will be part of Israel. That's more controversial. But if you prepare the ground and you have something to work with, it is something I would be prepared to support. The second thing, and this is also controversial, one of the things I would like to see the Israeli government do as part of this initiative is to offer financial incentives to those who live outside the blocks to move back into them. Now, this could become expensive. I would actually support us helping to defray the costs of that. Now, that's controversial because every American administration, with the possible exception of this one, has not favored settlement building, and especially not settlement building outside the blocks. So to then say, well, we're going to help you pay for relocating those that we told you not to go there in the first place, that's a bit of a problem. But again, you have to weigh it against what the Israelis would be doing and the significance of the move. So even after our own discussion on this, we come out on this one in favor. Understand, when David and I wrote this, I would say we agree on 95% of things. But that 5% produces an interesting discussion. And it also makes the book more interesting as a result. Okay, so why don't I stop there? Now you have more of a sense of what the book is, and it can be pre-ordered on Amazon after Shabbat. Okay, whatever you want to ask.
And Ellen, why don't you stand up and introduce yourself? I mean, just your name,
Yes.
and then your...
Hillary Smith-Packard, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure.
It's really interesting. I can't wait to read the book. In the meantime, I won't make a statement. I'll just squeeze in two questions.
Sure.
One is, can you elaborate more on the whole annexation and how you see the impact of that, both in Israel and internationally? And then the second one is if you could just comment on the Trump-Kushner peace initiative.
Okay. So the problem with annexation, if it's not...
Questions for the microphone.
Okay, so there were two questions here. The second question was the Trump-Kushner plan, and the first question was about annexation, Israeli annexation. Could I talk a little bit more about that? I obviously don't favor annexation divorced from a real political initiative where the Arabs and Palestinians have been given a chance to respond. I mean, Palestinians, if they were to stop doing what we call pay for slay, meaning you provide money to the families of terrorists or those who are in Israeli jails who committed acts of violence, the longer they're in jail, the more their families get. So they're given priority and they're given financial benefit. That needs to end. But they also need to acknowledge the historic Jewish connection to the land. You know, one thing that the Palestinians never do, they'll always say, the Jews aren't a people, it's just a religion. The reason they say that is because they want to deny that there's a legitimacy to the connection to the land. And just having them acknowledge, in response to what Israel does, that, okay, we understand that the Jews are a people, we understand there's a historic connection to the land. That would be big, it would have an impact. But annexation, what the right now wants to go ahead and start annexation. What it guarantees is they'll be completely alone. And I don't know how the Trump administration would respond, but I know how the rest of the world will respond, and I know what the impact in this country outside of the Trump administration is. Trump is obviously a polarizing figure. I would say, he doesn't have more than 5-6% approval ratings among Democrats. He has about a third support among independents. And in the Jewish community, it's probably at least 75% alienated. One of the problems with what Bibi is doing right now by embracing him is, I've said to Bibi, any Israeli prime minister wants and should have a good relationship with the American president. But you don't have to hug him. You don't have to look like you're embracing him. And obviously for political reasons now you have these big banners along the Ayalon Highway of the two of them. And he's coming here, 2 weeks before the election, where there'll be another big embrace. Well, what that does is it alienates the Jews, the Democratic Party. It looks like there's a choice to make Israel a completely partisan issue, and over time that will come back to haunt Israel. The annexation will not be accepted here. Even if the administration doesn't oppose it, it'll have a legacy. So it's a mistake to do this if it's not done the way I describe it, because then it's part of something that's been jointly worked out. And the Arabs and the Palestinians, you can say, they had a chance, and they weren't prepared to do anything in response to a meaningful Israeli initiative. That changes the context. There are those who want to push just for the blocks. There are those who basically want to annex Area C, which would be, then it's a complete disaster, because then they've guaranteed it's one state. The peace plan, whenever it comes. Anybody who says they know what's in it doesn't know what they're talking about, unless it's Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, or David Friedman. They have kept this very close to the chest. It's true. They have reached out to us. But I like to describe it as a one-way conveyor belt. Feed in, but nothing comes back. So I don't know what the impact is of the kind of things that many of us have conveyed. I can say that I've said to them, Abu Mazen will do everything he can to say no, unless you create a context where he can't escape. Now, the only way you can create that context is by having the Arabs. When they came in, they believed in something called outside in, meaning the Arabs can either deliver the Palestinians or be a substitute for the Palestinians or pressure the Palestinians in public. So we just work with them, everything will work out. They have come to understand that will not happen. That doesn't mean the Arabs don't have a role to play. The Arabs, if the Arabs were to say, and they won't say more than this is a serious basis for negotiations. We have questions about it, we have reservations about it, but it's a serious basis for negotiations. If they were to say that, that would put Abu Mazen in a very difficult spot. If we had that in our pocket before unveiling it, the Europeans wouldn't be more Arab than the Arabs. Then you really deny Abu Mazen his escape route. So he won't say no at that point. But to get to that point, you have to share the plan in writing with key Arab leaders, which has not been done. And you have to put them in a position where they can point to something that's in the plan that proves it's serious. So it means the state that's provided has to look real, and it means basically Arab East Jerusalem has to be the capital for that state. No Arab leader will say this is serious if you don't have those two elements in it. Will that be in the plan? I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
If you could, going back to the demographics, would you talk about what percentage and trends for people who are from the Philippines, people who are from Africa, people coming to Israel from other places?
They're not being accepted as races.
Well, but neither are Palestinians. I mean, you were giving, your numbers were not just citizens.
The total number of people like that in Israel is, First of all, they don't all stay necessarily. And secondly, the total number is probably not more than 150,000. So it would not affect the demographics. That's the essence of your question. In the back?
Thank you so much for your time. How serious is the anti-Semitism from the left and the right, and how do you suggest we counter it? And anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
The question was, how serious is anti-Semitism from the left and the right, and is it also anti-Zionist? Well, we start with the fact, on the left, it's anti-Zionist. I think it's serious in the sense that, especially because the progressive left is becoming more prominent now in the Democratic Party. One indication of how things are changing here, you had this legislation on BDS at the ACLU opposed anti-BDS, opposed because they said it basically infringed on free speech. none, except for Amy Klobuchar, none of those who are running for the presidency voted against it. You had 24 Democratic senators who voted for it. The reason that's significant is in the past, there would have been a taboo. And you would have basically, maybe you would have had 1 or 2 people who would have voted for it. You wouldn't have had 24. And it means there's a constituency out there that they feel they can't ignore. One of the challenges in the Democratic Party is going to be to try to come up with a set of boundaries within which the discussion on Israel can take place. This is not an argument to say you can't be critical of Israeli policies. There are Israeli policies that deserve criticism. That's okay. Criticism of Israeli policies is not the same as saying Israel shouldn't exist. The BDS movement is about no Israel. You know, those who say, no, it's just about occupation, the founders of it defined occupation as including Tel Aviv. So it's about no Israel. And they try to hide that fact. So in my view, if you're anti-Zionist, I do view that. I won't say every single person, because there are some Jews who are probably post-modernist, you know, are completely secular, don't believe that such a thing as a state of the Jewish people should be there. But the vast majority of those who are anti-Zionist, the fact is they're saying the Jews don't have a right to a state. And they will delegitimize, they will seek to delegitimize anybody who says the Jews have a right to a state. That's anti-Semitism. By the way, the only ones ever prepared to criticize are the Israelis. I once gave a talk in London where I was asked the question about my reaction to the fact that Academic Union and some other British unions had voted to boycott Israel. And what was my reaction to it? And I said, I guess I missed their votes. This was during the worst time of Darfur. I said, I guess I missed their votes to boycott China, because China supports the Sudanese government that's carrying out a genocide in Darfur. I must have missed that. I guess I probably also missed their vote against the Arab League, which is protecting Sudan. Right, I guess I missed those votes, right? And there's silence in the audience. And I said, oh, there weren't such votes? Well, then there's only one explanation, isn't there? And someone says, what? I said, if the only ones you hold to a certain standard happen to be the Jews, what does that say? It's anti-Semitism. On the right, it's traditional, right? It's who they are. I mean, the right is anti-Semitic, the white supremacists and so forth, you know who they are. The left represents this kind of, I mean, the real left, the European left, not the American left. The European left embodies this outmoded view of U.S. imperialism. Israel is an extension of U.S. imperialism. That's who they are. The problem is they dominate European media. They dominate the academic circles there. There are 30 campuses in this country where they're alive and well. Now there's also, there's a couple thousand campuses. So it's not a universal phenomenon, but it's a pretty significant phenomenon on a small number of prominent campuses, although not necessarily the ones you think of. I was in a conversation last week and earlier in the week actually, and I got into a discussion on this, and the person asked me, oh, so is Yale one of the prominent ones? I said, no, actually Yale's not. And actually Harvard also, minimal, not that prominent there, but Brown University, oh, absolutely. The whole University of California system. A lot of small liberal arts colleges. That's where you see it, and it's justice for Palestine is what is very prominent, and of course justice for Palestine means injustice for Israel. Yes?
First of all, thank you for very interesting talk. There's one issue that I wonder if you can address it. When if Palestinian state would be
question was, if there's a Palestinian state, how do you deal with the Arabs of Israel? Because I'm paraphrasing now, because many of them see themselves as Palestinians, and how would a two-state reality work under those circumstances? You know, if you first the leaders of the Arab political parties in Israel are more extreme than their constituents. If you did a referendum, you know, Avigdor Lieberman it's not that he wants to move the Arabs out, he wants to move the border like 800 meters to the left so that you take the area from Fahim down to Kafr Qasim, and it's probably 250,000 Arabs, that if you move the border 800 meters to the west, they would now be part of the Palestinian state, assuming it's there. If you did a referendum for all the Arab citizens of Israel and asked them would they want to live in the Palestinian Authority or, let's say, a Palestinian state, what do you think the vote would be? The answer is yes, for some there is absolutely an identity, but they're not prepared to give up their Israeli citizens. And they're not prepared to somehow be, you know, a Palestinian. You know, there are some people who say, so what if we had the settlers who stay behind in the Palestinian state and the Arabs who live in Israel, what if each of them had a connection with, you know, with their state? Completely unworkable, but, you know, even then, they wouldn't want it. Now, I don't know, look, maybe in 25 years, if the Palestinian state was a going concern, it was credible, had an effective economy, wasn't corrupt, had a rule of law, maybe it would change things. Maybe. But the fact is, the fact that they don't want that speaks volumes. And that's why, I mean, I don't know how soon, realistically, Palestinian statehood can emerge. The one Palestinian leader, Salam Fayyad, who was determined to build institutions, in the end failed because basically what he was pushing for was reality and not symbolism. He wanted to build a state from the ground up the way the Jews had built a state from the ground up. And until Palestinians emerged who were prepared to do that, if you had a state, it would be a failed state. So, you know, it's not a surprise that the vast majority of Israeli Arabs would not want to be in the Palestinian state. So I think the whole issue, you know, right now, this is truly an abstraction. We're a long ways from that. Yeah.
What advice do you give just, you know, regular American Jews living their life and working their job and bringing their kids who would like to do something to kind of facilitate a vision that you're talking about to kind of do practically in their life?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, one of the recommendations we make in the book at the end, which I didn't go through before, and it may be less individuals, but you can be part of delegations. I would like to see the administration, delegations from the Congress, delegations from synagogues that go to Israel, when they meet, whoever they meet, if they meet people in the government, ask them the question, what are you doing to ensure Israel doesn't become a binational state? If this became a mantra, a question, with Israeli media people, with people in the Knesset, people in different parties, Israelis who you meet, I think this is one of the ways to begin to make this issue one that does get joined in Israel. I'm, by the way, intrigued by, Gantz hasn't said a lot, but in his opening speech, he certainly implied that he favored a separation. Doesn't surprise me. Look, most of the military, they think in the first instance about, you know, they see themselves as protectors of the state. And it's not a surprise that most of them have this attitude. So this point of raising the question, I think this needs to become part of the discourse. If we're really going to have the debate emerge in Israel, so it can't be denied, it can't be hidden, one role Americans can play at every level, official and non-official, is to start asking the question, what are you doing to prevent Israel from becoming a binational state? Erwin.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, I know you've met most of the prominent Arab leaders, and I wanted to get your opinion in terms of really getting some insight into comparison between Arafat, Abbas, and others.
Look, there is the question had to do with comparison of Arab leaders, particularly Arafat and Abbas. When Abbas was basically Arafat's number two, he was very different than when he became number one. Arafat was someone who never foreclosed options. So what we were asking him to do with the Clinton parameters was 3 words that made it impossible to accept. End the conflict. No more grievances, no more claims, end the conflict. The problem was that the conflict defined Arafat. He wore his keffiyeh in the shape of Palestine. I once, at the end of negotiating the Hebron Accord, and I had been there, this was a second 23-day shuttle where I literally did it around the clock. I went down and had dinner with him before I left. And he said, why do you, don't go, stay. I said, no, I'm going. And he said, to do what? I said, to take a vacation. And he goes, gee, it must be nice to take a vacation. So I said, well, you could use one. And he said, gee, I haven't had a vacation since 1962. So I said, you could really use one. And he says, and there's nobody else there, it's just the 2 of us. And I've literally been living with the guy. He says, how can I take a vacation from my people? This was his self-image. The struggle defined him, and suddenly we were asking him to give it up. So Abu Mazen was never like that. He didn't see himself as an iconic national liberation figure. And he was a guy starting in 1972 who actually defined his identity within the PLO as outreach to the Israelis. So for a long time, I believe he emotionally believed in a 2-state outcome. And it's not that I think he doesn't believe in it now, it's just that he's not prepared to do anything about it. And I don't quite know when it switched. But I know at a certain point he switched from wanting the state, Palestinian state to be his legacy to not being a betrayer as his legacy. And I don't know exactly when it was, but I know it happened. Because he had moments where he could have responded. And every time he's had a chance, he hasn't done it. And as I said, look, when he's gone, one of the arguments will be, look, he tried negotiations, he was against violence. The argument's going to be, okay, let's try something different. So, I mean, he has, to his credit, he's been against violence all along. He may not be able to make the decision for statehood, but he's been against violence and terror. That's, if you talk to anybody in the Israeli security services, they rue the day when he's not going to be there. Yeah.
Okay, Barbara, 2 quick questions, one forward-looking, one backward-looking. Forward-looking, Netanyahu this week formed a coalition with what the board has called the equivalent of a clan. Other pejorative things have been said. Setting aside the U.S.-Israel relationship, if Netanyahu does get reelected, what does that mean? Question going backwards is, what was the moment where the negotiations got closest? When were we at the closest moment where peace was possible? If you have the time, why did it fall apart?
Well, I did write one book on that called The Missing Piece, but looking forward, look, right now, what's clear is that Bibi is focused on his political survival. The fact that he postponed going to Moscow to see Putin so that he could make sure that on the far right there was a union so these right-wing votes wouldn't be lost because they're below the threshold, and that meant reaching out to a Kahana follower, means that for those who think that the election is not a close call, he thinks it's a close call. What would he do? I mean, I raised this before. I don't know what he does if he's the one able to put together a government. Does he go, as I said, for a narrow right-wing alternative because they're driven by their ideology and they don't care what he does, and the legalities, but then they will dictate to him what is possible just so he can stay as prime minister? Or does he try to create a broad-based government which then looks like it can do something and the legal process could be a threat to it? I think the reason I said before I don't buy the conspiracy theory, the legal process in Israel is governed by its own dynamic. Israel is a state ruled by law. And it'll play itself out. It won't be put on hold because there's a political process. So I don't buy that argument. I'm not sure, I mean, we'll have to see. I'm not sure that Bibi necessarily will be in a position to have that choice. So a lot remains to be seen. If you ask me when were we closest with the Palestinians, I will tell you at the time of the Clinton parameters. We were closest because the Palestinian delegation that received the Clinton parameters, that were presented the Clinton parameters, and what Clinton did is he presented the parameters and then he left the cabinet room, and then I stayed behind and went over word for word to be sure that both the Israelis and the Palestinian delegations had exactly what they were. And it was not, it was probably like 5 pages worth of material. That Palestinian delegation agreed among themselves they should accept it. The leader of the delegation was Saab Erekat, and he collected all the notes from what was there because he said, we'll go back and we'll brief Arafat together. Because the only way to be sure that he would respond if it looked like this was a collective decision. And for reasons that only Saab knows, he went in alone and told them, don't accept it. Now, I don't know whether he would have accepted it if they'd all gone in that way, but I was having, last year I was having dinner in Rawabi with one of the Palestinians who was on that team. And he said to me, can you imagine where we would have been if he had said yes? We were very close with the Syrians, very close in December 1999, January 2000, and Barak got cold feet because he thought the politics weren't set well enough. It would have been a good idea to make that decision before he asked it to take a number of steps. But we were very close then because the Syrians, when we went to Shepherdstown, a location in West Virginia that was selected to meet Barak's need that all there would be no cell phone coverage whatsoever, so there could be no leaks whatsoever. The Syrians at Shepherdstown moved on every issue. They moved on the border, they moved on security, they moved on water, they moved on normalization. And Barak decided he had to make it look like this was hard, and he moved on nothing. And then Assad thought this was a trick. That wasn't what settled it, though. Showing that not all good ideas are good ideas, I knew that we were at risk of losing the whole thing if Shara, the foreign minister, had to go back to Assad and say, here's what happened. So I said, we have to have him go back with something. So I came up with the idea that we would do a draft peace treaty. And we would put I's and S's in places where there were differences. On the issue of peace, and we gave the Israelis and Syrians the draft. And we put on the top of each page a paragraph that said, these are American understandings of the Israeli and the Syrian positions. It doesn't mean they necessarily represent those positions, but these are American understandings of them. Now, we didn't bracket the content of peace. because they had agreed at Shepherdstown on it. The Syrians, because they weren't prepared, they didn't offer any comments, because they didn't want to offer any comments until they had shown it to Assad. They didn't make a single comment on the whole draft. Now, shortly after Shepherdstown, Haaretz leaked the draft peace treaty without the disclaimer on the top of each page, and with the language on peace appearing to be agreed, but the language on borders, the Syrian position was June 467, the language on Israel's was a border to be agreed. Didn't contradict it, but didn't say it was accepted. 2 days after the leak in Haaretz, the Writers' Union in Damascus said that Shara had sold out the Syrian cause by accepting peace but not getting the border. Now Assad, who was not well at that point, he understood this wasn't an attack on Shara, it was an attack on him. The sole reason that Assad was moving quickly to try to finalize is that he wanted this done before his son succeeded him. He thought it was too much for his son, taking this off the table and potentially open up. We had made all sorts of promises to the Syrians about what it would mean economically. I mean, Assad had agreed that the Golan Heights would be a economic development zone, which was good for Israel, because it meant if you built it up, it became a barrier to any kind of conflict later on. He had agreed that the Israeli wineries could stay there, even with Israelis being in part ownership of them. So he was foreseeing there was going to be significant economic payoffs which would help his son. But the minute the Writers' Union, which is non-existent, Writers' Union in Syria, this was a front for the security. And he saw this as suddenly, instead of helping his son, he saw it as basically threatening his son. And that was the end of it. We were very close there. Had we done that, not the Palestinians, then he would have had a peace with Egypt, Syria, if you had Syria, you had Lebanon, and Jordan. And it would have put the Palestinians in a position where they had no leverage. So that would have been a transformative event. Last one, or that's it?
Yeah, well, I have one last one.
Go ahead.
Which is, you've been in this business for a while, and there have been twists and turns and forward motion and backward motion. Part of me wants to ask what keeps you up at night, or what keeps you going? What keeps you maybe hopeful in this? Intellectually, I understand what keeps you intellectually interested in this.
Yeah.
But what keeps you hopeful about this?
There are a few people here who actually know my wife, Debbie. There have been times when she said to me, "You really are committed on this, and you really ought to be committed on this." I'll tell you, fundamentally what it is, you can't wish the Palestinians away. And if you care about Israel, and the two of us are lifelong supporters of Israel, then you can't give up. The minute you give up, in effect, you're saying it's not worth it. But it will always be worth it, given what Israel represents. And so it's true. I mean, I got back last night from 2 days in Rome doing track 2 Israeli-Palestinian talks, because you're always looking for, all right, what is it we could be doing even in these circumstances now? And so what this book represents is, okay, we haven't given up on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but we realize unless something is done to change the dynamic, there's a reality that will be imposed on us, and it's not an acceptable reality. So long as there are ways to head that off, and so long as there are ways to try to change the circumstances so what isn't possible today can become possible down the line, I can say, now I'm speaking for the two of us, we'll keep trying.